We have one final conversation, and this is, I don't know if you've noticed that one of the themes today is money. Can you imagine that? Money, money, and what drives it and what compels investors, and let's get the perspective on, from investors on Arizona's space environment. Take it away.
Thank you so much. So we're talking about money. Is this on? Can you hear me? No? Not on. So perfect. Me and on switches. So we are talking, I guess, this afternoon about money and how to get more of it, not lose it, gamble it, you know, something, right? And so what I'd like to do is have our panelists, or really our fireside chat participants, introduce themselves and really get into a free-flowing conversation around what it's going to take to create more investment opportunity here in Arizona, to bring capital and resources to the state and keep it here. And really the idea of growing the market through both organic and created opportunities for investment here in Arizona. Now, as we get started, Kelly, please tell us a little bit about your background, who you work for, and why we should listen to you.
I think the jury will be out on why people should listen to me maybe at the end of the panel, but thank you for the question. It's a pleasure to be with you all. My name's Kelly Kiedis-Ogborn. I'm Vice President of Space Commerce and Entrepreneurship at Space Foundation, and I run a department there called Space Commerce Institute. So how many of you know Space Foundation or have heard of it? How many of you are going to be at Space Symposium? Yeah. So Space Foundation has been around for 40 years. We're a nonprofit headquartered in Colorado Springs. I'm in the Washington, D.C. office. And what's nice about the organization is we really serve the totality of the space ecosystem. So everything from elementary to emeritus. Most people know us by our annual Space Symposium that we're going into our 39th year in 2 weeks. And then we also, on the other end of the spectrum, have really robust K through 12 education. My portfolio is squarely in the middle. So my department, Space Commerce Institute, I launched it 2 years ago, really with the immense and growing focus on the space economy, and really to make space make sense for founders, for investors, for countries, on how they can scale and grow. So my charge is really growth into and growth within the space ecosystem. I'm a space economy strategist. And so what we do is we have programs and a lot of thought leadership around space. I'm actually happy to say that as of today, I can announce that we're doing a Space Edge Accelerator with ASU, along with 3 other universities that'll be launching this fall. So very excited about that. And why people should listen to me. I would say that something that's primarily unique about my background is I'm a sociologist who has been working in advanced science and tech for about 17 years. I have a DARPA background.
She's a unicorn.
So I have a DARPA background, so I kind of grew up in this environment with very discerning judgment on valuation of tech and how you actually move through the development pipeline, and I get to work with kind of everyone in the space ecosystem. So it's really making sure that business models are scalable, that they're effective, and that they're actually going to give the return that people want.
That's great. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And before we go to EHAB, I'd like to know a little more about the accelerator. When does it launch, and how do we find out more information?
Thank you for the question. So it officially launches in August, and we will be accepting applications at that point. So each university is going to be responsible for how they handle and accept the cohort. So along with ASU, it's also going to be Vanderbilt, University of Florida, and University of Central Florida, which is really exciting. And there's going to be focus on the biomedical community, because we really want to make sure that these industries that are really critical to growth and scalability are understanding proper and actual tangible pathways.
That's terrific. Jessica, are we
Jessica's
going to
the point person.
Are we going to be able to let all the participants know about the accelerator?
Absolutely, yes.
Awesome. Ehab, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me, everybody. Very nice to meet all of you. Excited to collaborate. Great to meet Jessica. Awesome to hear about Accelerator. Very much in tune with our mission. So my name is Ehab. I'm the director of the Plug and Play office in Austin. So I flew in from Texas. We have some colleagues here. We also have a Plug and Play office here in Arizona. It's been open for about a year. And we collaborate a lot with ASU, and we work with the Arizona Commerce Authority very closely, specifically Sandra Watson. She's been a phenomenal support to us. Just an incredible state here, very progressive, very friendly to startups. Is anybody here familiar with Plug and Play? All right, fantastic. So we are a venture capital firm. We have over 60 offices around the world, our headquarters in San Francisco, and there's really three sides of our business. We run accelerators that are free to startups. We don't take any equity. We don't charge anything to the startup. The reason we've designed it that way is we want to attract stage-agnostic startups. Because the second part of our business is we have over 550 corporate partners. So we are, basically, we function as almost free business development for startups. Massive companies work with us, over almost 60% of Fortune 1000 companies work with us, really identifying the problems that they want to solve. A lot of times we work with the CTO, the CIO, Director of Innovation, Director of Engineering, really identifying their technology gaps, and then partnering them with startups that really solve those problems. And they pay us to do that, right? And that's how we can afford to give the accelerator for free. And we launch these accelerators all around the world, and they're divided into 23 practices or 23 verticals. And so I'm specifically in Austin, I'm responsible for aerospace and defense. We work closely with the aerospace and defense team here as well. Plug and Play here in Arizona, we have aerospace and defense as well as advanced manufacturing and supply chain. I'm also responsible for a health tech vertical that we launch in Austin as well. But Texas is a booming environment. I think for us, how we can elevate the ecosystem together, I like to call it engineered serendipity. Because really the third part of our business is we invest. So we've invested in 2,500 startups. And the reason I call it engineered serendipity is we want to bring startups, corporates, and investors all together. We want to collaborate with other accelerators. I don't think we compete with other accelerators. We're very collaborative. So really excited to hear more about your accelerator, how it works, how we can work together with ASU and all the incredible organizations here in Arizona. Because I feel the energy in Arizona. It's like very, very exciting to be here. It's really my second visit to Arizona. And there's so many ways we can tie the Texas ecosystem to Arizona. So many ways we can tie in, our headquarters and all the ecosystem in California, and really our offices around the world, right? We have offices in Singapore and Japan and China, in Middle East and Europe. And so for us, we are a global growth partner for startups. And we really like to also be local, right? So if you look at all of our offices around the world, whether they're in Arizona or in Texas, there's basically a local flavor, right? And we try and design a program or an accelerator that really mirrors the strengths of that community. And we're so excited to be in Arizona because you have huge semiconductor focus here. Billions of dollars really just announced recently in the States, so that's really phenomenal. It kind of spills over into space and a lot of different verticals that we function in. So just really excited about this market and participating.
No, thank you again both for being here. We really appreciate it. And the outside of the state perspective is important to us. What I'd like to do is start with your perspective of sort of like the more global investment when it comes to space tech and deep tech. And we hear a lot of governments investing billions and billions of dollars in it. Do you have to have government investment? Is it typically a private-public partnership that you see? Or do you see private investment sort of solo launching new technologies as well? How would you define that sort of on a global scale?
It's up to you. Go ahead. Okay, I'll jump in first and feel free to add in. So for me, I can tell kind of the Texas story. So I'm my second time here, so I'd love to learn more about the local ecosystem here. But I can tell you what's been very effective in Texas, which I think Arizona can do the same, if not better. And curious to know, some of the elements if they exist here. In Austin specifically, there's Army's Application Lab, there's Defense Innovation Unit, there's AFWorks, and there's Army's Futures Command. And all of them are in downtown Austin. And they came to Austin in 2018. And Austin's, had this buzz of being, a tech hub, right, for years and years. But really, when those entities came to Austin in 2018, you saw an evolution of the ecosystem. You saw it going from really like a heavy software SaaS sort of ecosystem to really getting into deep tech and solving like more long-term problems, right? It's because the government leaned in. In 2018, they started offering, I think, close to $50 million. This is numbers that I can track, so I'm sure it's probably north of that. This is specifically in Austin. The year after jumped up to 120 million. And then most recently, it's crawled up to over $500 million of non-dilutive capital collectively deployed within Austin from these government entities. So I think about 2 or 3 PhD students coming out of UT Austin. They get a $2 or $3 million grant. They can kind of prove out their concept, build a prototype. And everything that I've seen funded through those mechanisms has been real dual use, right? So there has to be some maybe defense application, but you can take it into the private sector. And I just kind of seeing that evolution specifically in Austin, it's created like this center of gravity. And I think it's been very, very impactful, in my opinion.
I will say that both are critical. Both need to be engaged in very different ways. So when I work a lot with companies that want to go out and be privately funded, they are like, we just want to be a commercial space company, and I have to remind them that commercial alone is a myth, because it is. The government is still the main customer in space. They are a customer, they are a regulator, they are a validator, and they are an investor. Now, the investment threshold is different depending on what they invest in, but I think the broader question is, how do companies engage them from a strategy based on the stakeholders' mission and their risk threshold? Because it was mentioned a bit more on one of the earlier panels, but the way that the government assesses progress in a technology is different than the way that an investor does. Because an investor is looking at really quick wins, ROI, demonstrated capabilities, where for the government, it may be more mission critical assets that they're willing to take a bit more risk because the opportunity on the other end has much more upside. And so you can decouple the two, but you really can't. And so for companies, when they are forming, they really have to understand how to engage each stakeholder and how to combine that so that they're successful with their development.
Those are great points. Now, before we get into all those details, and I have many questions to unpack there, I want to talk a little bit about where the United States is when it comes to investment and where other countries are. So who are our primary competitors?
You're talking about private capital or?
No, I'm sorry, government capital.
Government capital. So the U.S. is still top. And just to throw out some numbers of valuations of the ecosystem, I think it's important. So the Space Foundation puts out an annual space economy number that quantifies the year prior. So we're currently quantifying the year 2023. That number is going to come out this summer. But the current number that we're operating on is $546 billion, which looks at the year of 2022. We are conservatively estimating by the year 2027 that that's going to reach $772 billion. So big numbers. Of that, 78% is commercial, 23% is government, or 22% is government split. When you look at country investment, the U.S. is...
Let me just clarify there. So 76%...
78.
78% is being used in the commercial world.
Is commercial revenue.
Is commercial revenue, okay. And then 22% is government revenue.
Government global spending.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
When you look at the top spenders across the globe, from a government perspective, the U.S. is still top, and then it's followed by the European Space Agency and kind of all of Europe, and then China is third.
Thank you for the clarifying information, for sure. And let's talk a little bit about dual use. So we hear that a lot, and then how would you encourage people to position their concept, both from a commercial standpoint and then a government standpoint? And where can people go to not only read about it, but really be able to talk to somebody like you, Kelly, or you, Ehab, that have real-life experience in how they position this?
Yeah, so again, our core business is private sector. And so I always encourage founders and startups to really be thinking about, from day one being a dual use company, right? Because a lot of times government is not going to be a sufficient customer for you. And a lot of times it really have to get founders to think outside the box, right? They could have maybe a DoD-focused innovation in one specific sort of vertical, but maybe that technology also applies to healthcare in the private sector and healthcare. It has nothing to do with like a whatever defense kind of capability that they were focused on initially. So a lot of times you got to reskin a technology. So it's like really thinking outside the box. And we try and challenge founders and startups to do that by getting them in front of enterprise as quickly as possible. And so we really take a deep dive with our private sector partners. Again, over 550 corporate partners, work with Plug and Play and subscribe to our offices all around the world. And we really try and understand what their problems are. And we really try and kind of relate that and prepare the startups to tackle those problems in the private sector. So I think, dual use, especially when you're like tackling a deep tech technology, you really have to be thinking about as many applications as possible so that you can kind of, pass that valley of death. Because if you get stuck, being one feature, you could really get into trouble very quickly and just kind of, run out of gas.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And the word that I'll add to it is an iterative approach. So there's the eventuality of what we want to build in space, and then there's what actually space brings to bear now. And so when you talk about scalable and sustainable business models, you have to be able to calculate for how you're going to make money, how you're going to build, and where your further roadmap is. And that is dual use in many ways. But for some founders, they want to jump 10 years ahead without realizing that there's a component or an IP or something that they can leverage now to keep their company afloat while they're going on that eventuality. So in some ways, it's not suspending the dream, but it's retweaking it in a way that's going to allow them to be profitable now and iterate on their dev timeline as they're going to actually scale.
So, and just to be clear for the super nerds in the audience, let's say I'm a super nerd here at ASU named Alan, and I am coming up with something that's just really cool, and it has a narrow application for the government. But I don't know anything about health, and I don't know anything about other areas where there could be an application. That's not my area of expertise, nor is it my area of interest. How do I go about asking the right questions to get the information that you guys are driving at?
To move into other adjacent markets.
Right, to find out what other applications exist for my great idea.
Yeah, I think it comes to surrounding yourself in the right environments. So the good thing about space, and I think the good thing about deep tech in general, is that it attracts a lot of really interesting, curious people, and not shy people either. So I think putting yourself in the environments where you can ask the questions and say, I don't know, can you point out other things? And I'm sure that people can come up with like 10 other use cases. The one thing I will say too, though, about dual use is it doesn't necessarily have to be a one-for-one comparison. So when you look at a lot of the technologies, and I can say this, formerly I was at DARPA for years, and there were very complex systems that were built. That complex system transitioning out of the government does not necessarily have commercial application in the private world, but a component might. And so it's this concept that I was like, it's technological deconstruction, but looking at what you have. Are there subcomponents? Are there processes? Are there ways of doing things that can transfer to other industries to then move forward their ecosystem? There's a lot of different ways that things can be transferred to adjacent markets.
And Kelly, can somebody reach out to you that, let's say, is a super nerd at ASU and ask these questions and get direction from you?
I literally have built my career working with super nerds, so I encourage it.
So for those super nerds in the audience, please
me.
get her
Yeah.
email. She's the lady that you want to talk to.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple points. So I think working with something like a Plug and Play, we actually try and make that as easy as possible. So again, we run 23 verticals all around the world. Some of them overlap, right? So like aerospace and defense kind of touches into the semiconductor world. And so really come to our events. A lot of them are free, they're open to the public. Specifically, actually, our two biggest events in June, we have a huge summit. I think we draw like 3,000 or 4,000 folks. It's in June and in December. So it's just our summer summit and our winter summit happens in our headquarters. All 23 of our verticals sort of graduate. So they fly in from all around the world. A lot of our corporate partners attend that. And it's just like a geek fest. And so that's a great opportunity where there's multiple panels all happening in parallel. And so you can, if you're in the space world, right, you can kind of go to the room next door and learn about maybe your technology is relevant in that specific vertical. So we try and make that as easy as possible. And it goes back to this concept of engineered serendipity, right? If you get all the right people in the room, the magic is going to happen, right? And so I think, come to events, right? We like to partner and collaborate. And so for me, for example, in Austin, the Arizona team does very similar. In Austin, I'm, as the director there, I have to host, close to 40 events a year, right? And sometimes that means that, I bring in third-party experts, right? That maybe they have expertise in a particular area. And those are resources that we offer both to our corporate partners. There's two audiences that we cater to. It's our corporate partners, our corporate executives, and then the startups, right? And we're constantly doing these workshops, whether it's like a defense academy, teaching startups how to, get contracts with the government. Or, sometimes it's, workshops for executives, understanding how to work with startups, right? So you don't break the startup. And kind of getting your corporate ninja attorneys to slow down, all these exclusive clauses that they put in with the startups and really get them to kind of speed up their engagements with startups. So there's really, for us, that's teaching on both sides. And the last point I'll add is one of the things I try and do a lot, and I think a lot of our colleagues at Plug and Play, I keep pointing to Dave, by the way. So Dave and Brian.
Will you raise your hand, please?
If you raise your hand.
Stand up,
they're
turn
both here in Arizona. So certainly welcome to reach out to me. I'll geek out with you over Austin and Texas, and we have local folks here. But a lot of times I encourage founders to collaborate with other founders. Because again, they're like almost laser focused on being one feature, right? So like one of my clients, for example, is the Chief Innovation Officer of the Air Force Office of Energy. And they need multiple technologies combined into a global solution to really drive major impact, to tackle the huge problems that they're trying to tackle. And so one of my struggles is getting 2 or 3 founders to collaborate. Sometimes they see each other as competitors. No, I don't want to share this. I don't want to share that. And I really try and kind of push that thought process forward. And I think that's another way to learn, how you can kind of tweak your model and get more contracts.
And before we sort of go to the funder side of the conversation, if you're a student, do you get a discount for some of the events that you all host? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, again, almost all of our events are free, including our acceleration model, right? And again, it's purposely built that way. So in our accelerator, we technically don't really teach anything, right? We literally take the founder's hand and we match them to a corporate that needs their technology, right? So there's really no curriculum, and it's designed to be free, where we don't take equity, we don't charge anything, because we want to attract stage-agnostic startups, right? A lot of the startups that work with us and are very successful with us are enterprise-ready. So, if you're a student, you're kind of starting off, come to our events. Most of them are open to the public. And as you build something and really get to, certain stages, just be very active within the Plug and Play ecosystem.
No, that's terrific. I think it's wonderful that you offer so much that's free of charge and really meant to enhance the ecosystem in all of the areas that you guys work in. That's really great. So as we transition into the money piece of our conversation, I've found here in Arizona in particular, when we are talking to funders, they speak a different language than the founder does. In part, sometimes it's around the technology piece, but really I've found a big generational gap. Have you seen that as well? So, somebody that is maybe very, that is in a point in their life where they've had exits, or they've been a corporate executive for many, many years. They're going into retirement and they're at a certain stage in life and do have resources, significant resources to invest. They're talking to a young super nerd and they just seem to speak different languages.
So I can say from my perspective, it could potentially be generational, but I think it goes back to your original point of not knowing the questions to ask. And the reason I say that is space has become a vertical that has gained a lot of excitement, a lot of interest, a lot of attraction. It's interesting because the actual private capital investment portfolio has slowed down significantly because of the SPAC boom and bust, and I'm happy to talk about what that did to the ecosystem. We could get into that. But I think part of what was so exciting about it is people were like, well, if I don't have a space strategy, I need to have a space strategy. And so you saw a lot of these funds that would create and carve off a portion and put people that didn't know anything about space. That can be good or bad, because especially if you're looking at building out what we want, it was all talked about in the speculative low Earth orbit economy, which is true. We're all betting on a hypothesis, but there are at least questions that should be asked to prove out some sort of model. And when people don't know what questions to ask, the conversations are totally mismatched, because the technologists might be talking about the eventuality that they want to build, and they're not even on the same framework. And so I think that there needs to be some sort of playbook about what we're talking about, to get everyone level set about like what is the space economy, what are actually the verticals that are driving revenue, how is it going to build out, because then there's at least some sheet of music that people are operating against.
And do you see somebody authoring that playbook? Like, I don't know, plug and play?
And we do that too.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Maybe co-authors?
Yeah.
Sure, I'd love that.
Yeah.
Again, we're super collaborative, so we'd love to connect and collaborate on multiple fronts. But I think that's a great question. I'll give you my individual opinion, so it might not be a plug-and-play approved answer. Don't tell anybody, David. But what I've observed in Texas is it's not a Silicon Valley, right? And so in my opinion, what that means is it's kind of like old money. There's a lot of family offices, super conservative, right? Even within Austin, like everybody talks about Austin being a Silicon Valley. It's still far from that, right? And I can speak about that because, we go to our headquarters often and we see a lot more early stage investors in Silicon Valley, right? And I think for us, one thing that we want to be, or at least I want to be intentional about for a city like Austin, and maybe this, in some ways relates to Arizona, is being that connective tissue to Silicon Valley. And what I mean by that is, in Texas, we're slowly kind of getting those family offices to kind of dabble into the VC world, really expand their portfolio. And it's a lot of kind of grunt work for us, really getting them to just, get into earlier stage companies. The good news is like a lot of VCs have moved into Texas, right? And then they bring other VCs, right? They don't necessarily move into Texas, but our world is very relationship driven, and it's, once you see some VCs coming into Arizona, you're going to see a lot more, and so you gotta figure out how to keep that momentum going. And so, going back to gaps, what I see, at least in Texas, because there's kind of this traditional family office, old school side, like let's say old money. It's a little bit more conservative, right? So like they're kind of starving the entrepreneur a little bit more. Reach this milestone, and then we'll give you this kind of. So in a city like Austin, again, I don't know if this applies to Arizona. I think you can get kind of better deals, right? Especially if you're coming from like a California where there's so many early stage investors kind of fighting for some cool ideas. And then you go to a city right here that has so many brilliant engineers. Like I was fascinated to learn that there's 32,000 engineers coming out of ASU. That's pretty mind-blowing for me. Very innovative community. So I think to summarize, figure out a way to kind of draw those VCs in, and then that will hopefully close that gap.
Can I add one thing? I also think it's cultural. So when you were talking, it made me think of this. So one of the interesting phenomena that happens within space is there's this altruism for the future that we want to build, and then there's the pragmatic, practical approach of what's actually sustaining the markets. When you look at investors, they are on the pragmatic side. Unless you get really risky investors, and there are some out there, but there aren't many. On the other side of the house, if you get someone who is a tech founder, they are going to be so excited and enthusiastic for what they can build and what they can do. And so again, culturally, they're not even they're talking past each other, even though they could be talking about the same thing. So it's also how you view tech maturation, valuation, and impact, because they're going to view impact in very different ways.
Great points, both. And I want to dig into some of those points in just a second after we finish the playbook conversation. I'm very interested in the playbook conversation. So can people go online and see, like from your website, see what the playbook is, Kelly? Or if you already author this, what is that? How do we get the playbook?
It's a great question. So there's a couple of different playbooks, I will say. So part of my charge with the department that I run, I mentioned like making space make sense, and that means different things to different people. So we do things like space incubators and accelerators for entrepreneurs. We also do a lot of strategy, particularly for companies and emerging countries. And it's really getting them to understand the ecosystem and the industries that they have that exist and how that spins into space. So it's less something that's published, although I am currently working on a handbook for countries to engage the space ecosystem that's currently being written. But it's more engaging with us. The benefit that I have with my department being embedded within the Space Foundation is I can leverage literally 40 years of resources and contacts and content and really work across the totality of the ecosystem. So if I don't know the answer, I know someone who does. And this goes back to the piece of collaboration, because really the future does need to be collaborative. And when you go to a playbook, like nobody has all of the answers. And there's reasons why we're at different parts of the value chain, and we need to be able to sync to actually move it forward.
So I love what you guys are saying, because from a funder standpoint, we really need more information, right? And so if we could even collaborate with the two of you and invite you to a funders conference, the conversation there that we are now going to host with Jessica, that because we need sort of to level set on the vocabulary and the vision and all be talking about the same thing. Because whether it's cultural or generational or just a lack of understanding of what questions to be asking, we need to address that, because we see that in Arizona all the time. So this is a real estate state.
Well,
right? And it's a real estate economy that is just now starting to shift.
Well, and strategies are dependent on who you're developing the strategy for. So there is really no one size fits all when it comes to space. There are basic principles that you can operate on, but if you're depending on the threshold size of the company, what market they're going into, what subcomponent, what country they are, what industries they have, I mean, it's all variables. And so you can work with maybe like 60% of the same information, but that 40% has to be customized for who you're talking to. And that's why these types of conversations are important, because information is one thing, but then what you do with that information and how you execute is really the critical piece.
But I think you bring up an excellent point. Know who you're talking to. Take the time to do the background research. Take the time to call Kelly, to call EHAB and be like, hey, do you know this person? I'm going to be having a conversation about funding, and I need to know everything you know. So I am framing it in such a way that it can be understood.
I promise this is not a play on words, but it's actually pretty funny. I'm going to have to give credit to our marketing team. So we actually have a product called Playbook. And on that product, we have over 70,000 startups in our ecosystem that we've cataloged. We've collected data on. We try and understand what stage they're on, what their value proposition is. And we've put all of that into a database. And we give access to that database to our corporate partners. In Arizona, we work with Arizona Commerce Authority. We've given them access to that playbook. And this is a tool that we use globally. We have, again, 60 offices around the world, and we need to catalog all the startups we work with. And this is how we centralize our data. This is how we source technology companies so that we can solve problems for our corporate partners. In addition to that, what we do is we provide what we call industry trend reports. And so after working with thousands and thousands of startups and getting them in front of hundreds and hundreds of corporate partners, we understand which startups are successful in having traction with different POCs with different corporate partners. And we publish these industry trend reports. Usually those are given to our corporate partners, right? To executives that really want to understand the maturity levels of different technologies. And so we'll categorize the technology. So the way that we run an accelerator, for example, an aerospace and defense accelerator, we'll have the aerospace and defense large enterprise partners that kind of comprise that value chain working together with us, identifying the key common areas that they want to solve for as a group. So they kind of get this collective sort of peer-to-peer, shoulder-to-shoulder, tackling large problems together. And then that creates a lot of intel that we can report to the group. But then we also do curated one-on-one, what we call deal flow sessions for each of those large corporates, right? Because what could be important to a Raytheon might not be as important to a Lockheed Martin, right? Or they don't want to share, the kind of the common areas that they're solving for. So we do kind of private deal flow sessions, and then we do deal flow sessions that are for the group. And then from that data that we collect, both from the thousands of startups and the hundreds of corporates, we do these industry trend reports. We do that for energy, we do that for aerospace and defense, for health tech, and you can really deduce a lot of incredible knowledge from those reports. And we make that accessible to our partners.
No, that's terrific. And so looking at it from a funder's perspective, particularly in today's day and age when people want faster and faster returns, this is not necessarily an area of technology where you get a fast turnaround. How do you manage positioning that, particularly to somebody who's new to this kind of investing?
That's a great question. There's a couple of ways I can answer it, so bear with me. So I will say that, as I mentioned, there has been a downturn in private capital investing, and I think for 2023 it was just shy of 18 billion. I think it was like 17.9, depending on who's counting.
And if you're rounding?
And if you're rounding, if you're rounding. And their investors are looking for quicker returns, and part and parcel to blame is the SPAC boom and bust. And I'll just mention this quickly, but
Please share your SPAC.
yeah, so this world I live in intimately. So, there was a lot of hype back a couple years ago, the SPAC boom and bust, and there were really bloated valuations of companies that were really PowerPoint space companies. So they were selling really great ideas. People got very excited. Valuations grew. Nothing came of it. And the industry really kind of revectored. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. And the reason for that is that we're now moving past hype. We're moving past moonshots to having very real conversations about what a cislunar economy can look like, but in a practical way, which it needs to happen. So it's really not just about a cool tech idea anymore, although those very much still exist, but it's what can actually give return. And what I've seen across the investment portfolio is that investors, in some regards, and you probably have a different perspective on this, but they've moved toward technologies that have more of a traditional product market fit or more adjusted. So a lot of satellites, a lot of satellite data, a lot of hardware, right? Like traditional infrastructure things. That doesn't mean that there isn't opportunity for the others. The challenge that I think from an investor side, and this goes about making space make sense and having better conversations, is I always say that I think that space has an optics problem. And the reason for it is because we still talk about space in very mythological terms, which it should. But there is space.
Can you define mythological terms?
Yeah, so there is space exploration, and then there is space business, and those are two different things.
Where is Jean-Luc Picard?
Exploration. He's mythical.
I love him.
Mythical. But part of the challenge is that it even goes back to when JFK gave his speech at Rice University, right? Like, we went to the moon and we confronted this unknown with optimism and enthusiasm, but we had never done this before. So we were taking a technological gamble. Space today still is a technological gamble, but it's not the gamble that it once was, because there are industries now that exist that are actually giving real return. And so what that gives to bear is that the market can be creative, stable, and risky all at the same time, but people just see the risk factor. And so they don't actually believe that there is the ability to get return and that there are these stable companies. And so you have to dissect it and get nuanced really quickly.
And that goes back to asking the right questions.
Asking the right questions, like get nuanced really quickly about what are you actually investing in and how can you build that iterative and scalable and sustainable business model? Because what might be possible now might not be possible in 5 years because we don't know what it's gonna look like. Like I said before, we're betting on a hypothesis, and so you have to be able to pivot, you have to be iterative, and you have to really closely follow your tech development timeline, because if you don't, you could be betting on something that's not going to be proven.
No, those are great points. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just give a quick example. So a company that I've been following very closely is a company called Solidian. And they're in additive manufacturing, and kind of the vision of this particular founder is to really solve the additive manufacturing problem in space, right? And it's kind of working towards that long-term vision is really, solving some earthly problems first, right? And going into private sector. And so I think, when you look at deep technology, hardware tech, whether it's space or any kind of hardware tech, it's hard to raise capital for, right? And I think your first check is really the toughest pill to swallow, right? And so as a founder, also knowing what the right questions to ask, you want to get to know who your prospective investors are. As you court them, a lot of it is relationship, especially your first check, right? And then, because in deep tech, you're maybe looking at a 7 to 10 year horizon.
At least.
Yeah, exactly. So you really have to, you got to figure out what you're going to do for those, those initial hard years, and you have to really find the right early relationships, right? That are going to trust in the founders. Maybe they invest more in the founders than in the actual product. So a lot of times you'll find investors that their thesis is built around investing in the founder and then product. And so you just really have to find those investors, and certainly we're here to help. Plug and Play, we are never a lead investor, so we can help you get in front of the right investors. We open up our network to you, and we try and get you in front of strategic partners that want to solve the same problems you want to solve.
Great. I do have a couple more questions for you guys, but I do want to remind the audience that we're going to have a little time for Q&A, recognizing that it is right before happy hour, and I know people need a snack and probably a glass of water with extra ice. And so I've had conversations with a couple of founders that are in the deep tech space, and they have these incredible visions. They have a vision of reimagining everything, the world even, and how we live here, and where manufacturing takes place, and how it takes place. It's just incredible. It's almost a little overwhelming, though, especially if you're a new investor to this conversation. You're thinking like, is this super nerd going to be able to stay focused? What are we doing here, right? And so what would be your advice to somebody that's putting this together, recognizing that they are building towards this incredible vision, and all of the great founders, right, in history had this incredible vision that they were building towards? How much information do you give or do you not give? Does it go back to it just depends on who you're talking to?
This is going to be a very sociological answer. This goes
a question
to like
for you.
my roots. Yeah. So, couple of interesting points. There's this concept called Maya that is used a lot in advertising, and it's most advanced yet familiar. It's like I'm forgetting the A. Sorry, it's been a long day. But the whole concept is that you have to bring people along and meet them where they're at. An interesting anecdote about how the human brain has evolved, this is where the sociological thing comes in, but like when you think about the origins of hunters and gatherers, right? So there was in crowd and out crowd, but it was around safety. And so because there were poisonous berries and wild beasts and things that could kill you, and so people had to make a calculus about what they would share and what they wouldn't share that was outlandish, because they didn't want to be outcasted from the tribe to potentially get eaten. We don't have those those kind of problems in society now, but our brains have not evolved past that. And so part of the challenge is that when you're sharing really radical ideas with people that do not share that same belief or can't even be on the same sheet of music, it's automatically discarded, even if it's factually accurate. So part of the challenge is that you have to meet people where they're at. And when I've worked with really smart, brilliant scientists before, I always tell them that you need to capture people with emotion, and then you captivate them with information. Because if you can paint a picture of what that world is going to look like, get them excited about it, get them to understand even conceptually what it looks like, then they will be more receptive to the information. But if you just lead with the information, their brains are literally going to shut off biologically.
Great information for the audience.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I actually 100% agree. I think a lot of times if you have, let's say, a technical founder, they could be very factual, really passionate about their technology, but you really have to kind of get them to think, in terms of business, right, in terms of scale and really how to get to the next level. And I think for me, that's really a significant challenge, right? I'm a pure business guy, just hardcore finance, show me the numbers. And a lot of times I believe in a founder so much that I'm willing to be patient. And I really, it's, when you're highly technical, you're obviously very, very skilled and you really understand the space. And if you really just talk too much, it's very challenging for an executive like a CTO or a CIO to really digest, what you're saying, right? And you could be like the leading expert in your space. So, for me, that's kind of, I have to be the medium between the executives and sometimes the super technical founder, which I believe in. And so, a lot of times what that means for Plug and Play is we're coaching founders and entrepreneurs really how to, speak business, right? How to communicate the problem that you're solving in as minimal words as possible. How to captivate an executive's interest and really get that executive to go to the next level. How to communicate your value proposition to different business units, right? You might have one business unit within a corporate that's super technical, and other business units that are out in the field, like they want to operationalize what what you've invented, and you have to be able to talk to both, right? Or you at least have to build a team that can talk to both. And that's really how you kind of scale a business. So I think that would be kind of the elements I would add.
Again, really good information for the audience. Now we're going to speed date before we open it up for questions. You guys ready? Yes. You have the first thing that comes to mind, okay? Okay, Kelly, you ready?
Are we doing like one-word answers or just anything?
Yes, one-word answers.
Okay.
Well, I guess it could be anything. Astronaut or Navy SEAL?
Ooh, astronaut.
Okay. We're learning a lot about her. Developer or engineer?
Engineer.
Pizza or ice cream?
I'm lactose intolerant, so neither.
You are no fun at a party. Rom-com or horror film?
I'm sorry, what is it?
Rom-com or horror film?
Oh, a horror film, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Liar. Mm-hmm. Now, and this is to both of you. Would you rather be a funder or a founder?
I'd rather be a funder.
And you are?
I think I would rather be a founder, and I'm definitely going to work towards that at one stage. Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you. You guys have been terrific. But now, before we give the applause and say how fabulous you are, we're going to open it up to questions in the audience. Oh, we have a couple questions. Fantastic. Please, by all means.
Thanks, Chase.
Your name, please.
My name's Ganhee Lee. I'm CEO of Catalyst Space. Y'all have laid out a really good logical framework. You used the word playbook, and I think that this panel is called Investor Perspectives. Very pragmatic perspective y'all have laid out. I do think there's a missing perspective here that I'm going to ask y'all to speak to. I know Michael was supposed to be on this panel, and that perspective of go big or go home. The old adage of it's easy to raise 50 million than it is to raise 5. Go and skip to the end state, forget the iterative stuff, and go build the big thing. And if you win there, you're going to transform an economy and capture that market from the ground. Can you speak to that perspective, speak to why you think the ecosystem might have evolved past that? Is that still a player here? And to Ehab, your point, I do think my second part of my question is, I do think in the Arizona ecosystem, we do lack kind of big investors that are willing to lead priced rounds. And so as a founder, as I go to raise my next round, I'm looking to the coasts, not internally in Arizona. So how does the evolution of that play out?
Great question.
So to your first point, I do think that there still is very much the go big or go home mentality. There are plenty of people that believe that. It goes back to the original point that I made about the market being able to be creative, stable, and risky all at the same time. Different companies and different investors fall within those different verticals. And I think it then goes back to the risk profile that we mentioned before. What's interesting about the investment landscape, and especially for those type of companies that are betting big on eventualities 10 to 15 years, what I've seen is that instead of VCs jumping in, there's more institutional banks and more institutional funders that are now starting to have conversations because they have the capital and the infrastructure and the institution to be able to fund such things and take on some of the valley of death issues that some of the others have. So there is a place for both. I just think that across the board, even for those go big or go home, you have to understand the environment you're going into. And especially when you're looking at how the economy is evolving, it is integrative across the board with companies. And so everyone has to evolve at least relatively in the same way. Like they were talking about on the mining panel, there's a lot of other companies that need to succeed for those business models to scale. And so it's just a threshold of how you level set and align all of that. But there is definitely a place for that perspective.
So to answer your first question, I mean, we've invested in 2,500 startups, and we have over 34 unicorns. And for us, we're very fortunate to have line of sight into startups that are gaining traction, right? And so that's kind of what feeds our thesis. So I would say we're a very non-traditional sort of VC because we have 550 corporate partners that basically tell us these are our problems, Ehab and David and Brian, go find us interesting technologies that solve these problems. So it's very hard for me to answer that first question because a lot of times like we have preset problems and we have guidelines and parameters that we work within. And then even there's, I think, 4 funds that we run verticals where we run actually the CVC arm for large enterprise, right? And they have infrastructure and they've communicated to us as the corporates that comprise that value chain. For example, in retail, it's multiple retail conglomerates, right? That basically gave us a bunch of money and we go out and invest it for them. And they told us before giving us that money what's important to them. And we already have thousands of startups approaching us. So for us, like we have this ecosystem that's built all around the world. And so if you are a founder in Arizona and you want to tap into any of our offices, even the ones in China or in Singapore or on the coast, as you say, each one of those offices has corporate relationships. Some of them might have CVC arms that we run. Certainly around all 60 offices, we have a venture arm that we deploy from our CEO's family office, who, by the way, was an early stage investor in Google and PayPal, and just has an incredible story. You guys should look into it. And so, he has an appetite from the family office, and then our corporate venture sort of arms have different appetites, right? So I guess that's really how I can address your first question. And then your second question, again, remind me, because I talked too much, I forgot the second one.
About going to the coast, right, to
Yes.
get capital.
Yeah, so going to the coast, I think it relates to what I said, in terms of Texas, right? And so for us, we're constantly trying to get founders exposure to all of our offices, right? And that's why in June, we have our June summit, and then in December, we have our December summit at our headquarters, Silicon Valley. Frankly, it doesn't matter if you are a founder here in Arizona, fly out to our June summit in Silicon Valley. We'll get you in front of investors there, and that's how we sort of add to the Arizona ecosystem, add to the Texas ecosystem, or Warsaw, Indiana, which has 18,000 people. We just opened an office there. So if you're a founder in Warsaw, Indiana, we're still going to get you connected to all of our offices.
That's the easy moves. Go out to the coast, raise my money there. What does it take? This is an Arizona coast.
So I'll jump in there. And being from the funder side, I really believe that you need to meet people where they are. I think Kelly was really profound, and that might not be anywhere near the neighborhood that you're in. And it might really take you stepping back and understanding the psychology of the person that you're going in to pitch and who their key influencers are. Maybe you don't pitch them first. Maybe you actually pitch their influencers, and then you go in to pitch them. You really, I think, need to approach it. At least in my experience, from what I've seen, folks being most successful when they almost approach it as an advocacy engagement versus a traditional pitch. And that is just because that's where this market is, and it's relatively nascent still. And we need to, and we need to encourage people to become as creative and as driven when it comes to the pitching as they are in building out their startup. It's not easy at all, but if it were easy, anybody could do it. So I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Anybody over here? No questions from the audience? So please, yes.
I've got one for mainly Ehab, but I'm pretty sure Kelly can also comment because of her work with entrepreneurship. But from a young perspective, as someone who's still caught in academia pushing the boulder up the mountain, there's a lot of language that we hear in the collegiate environment about young entrepreneurs saying, fine, I'll do it myself in the tech industry. And in this case, especially at Plug and Play, how do you measure the credibility of the sheer amount of startups that are happening in this present moment? How do you measure them based on their behavior, any assets that they developed over the time? Just off the noggin, what can you tell me?
It's a very tough question, but it's a great question. I will say that it's not a perfect science, right? It's definitely a process, right? So the way that I approach it, let's say specifically in Austin, we'll get a founder introduced to multiple corporates, and then we'll get feedback from the corporates. And so that feedback is very valuable for us, and then we share that feedback to the founder. I think from your journey, Imran, because I had a chance to talk to you in the hallway, I was fascinated by, number one, how young you are, how ambitious you are, how driven you are, and I think those are qualities that are really critical for any founder, any tech, because you really have to solve problems. Like, you're going to run into multiple problems, you're going to run into a brick wall, you got to figure out how to tackle that brick wall and knock it down. And so that's, like, for me, that's a core quality in a founder. And frankly, if you don't have that, like, you're really going to struggle. And maybe you could be highly technical and you don't have that skill set, but maybe surround yourself with others that do, and kind of, so also I would say, get really good at building a team, right? A team that you can trust. Because it is very true that a lot of startups fail, not because the technology is great, not great, but because maybe the founders are arguing amongst each other. Actually, more often than not, it's very tragic. So get really good at problem solving, get really good at building deep relationships with your co-founders, deep relationships with your customers, understanding their problem sets. These are, I would say, really critical traits. I don't know if you would add to that.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I would say that for me, credibility comes less from credentials or other things that you have, but more your ability to demonstrate that you understand what you don't know and how you're going to pivot. So entrepreneurship in any industry, but especially in space, is a full contact sport. It just is. And as I mentioned before, you're literally betting on a hypothesis. And so understanding what you want to build, where those roadblocks would be, if this doesn't pan out, how are you going to pivot? It really comes down to the resiliency of a business model. Because more chances than not, your first idea might not be the one that's going to pan out, but then how do you go to B, C, D? And do you understand that might have to happen? Because I've talked to plenty of founders that literally think they're the next Elon Musk and that their technology is ironclad, but they're an unproven, unflown entrepreneur. And so being able to take feedback, being able to know when to pivot, having the tenacity to pivot is also really critical. There's a saying that we used to say at DARPA, like, don't be afraid to kill your darlings. So if something isn't working, move on, right? I mean, the sunk cost is not going to get anybody far.
I'd add one more thing. How do you fail? So one thing that I want to know, and in the closed doors when folks are deciding who's going to get what money, like how the funding is actually going to go, those conversations are much less formal than you would imagine. Always comes up, how is this person going to handle, how is this founder going to handle failure? When they've given it their all, there is nothing more to give. You don't have any more intellectual capacity or physical capacity, and you still fall short. How are you going to deal with that moment? That's literally one of the most important elements from a funding standpoint. Sir, yep, the stage is yours. Thank you so much for everything. You guys have been amazing.
The only thing between all these wonderful people and the reception is you and me.
I think we're going to just chit-chat.
That's it. That's it. And let me get you a mic. So here you go.
Thank you.
I feel like you guys know that Far Side cartoon with the kid in the back of the class. Like, may I be excused? My brain is full. Everybody's brain is full, right? But not your bellies. I think we have a lot of people to thank first, right?
Yes,
and
we do.
I'll start by thanking all of you all for coming. Thank the speakers and the panel moderators. What great questions, what great topics. Yes. You tell us who we need to thank on the organizational side.
Yeah, let's pull up those names. So I want to thank all of the planning committee that are here, and that it was really a pleasure working with you all for the last several months to pull off this event. So thank you. Thanks to everyone here. If you see them and you know them, please thank them. And then, what do we have next? So yeah, also thank you to the ACA. So the ACA is going to take the lead on writing the report this year. Of course, the whole planning committee will be involved. If anyone else would like to help us or give us some thoughts or ideas on what should be included in the report, this is a community, a community effort. And so we'd love to hear from you and have you involved. But I think maybe in the next 2 months, we should be able to get that out. So a little plug for our newsletter. So the Interplanetary newsletter, we'll include it in there if you want to receive that report in your inbox.
I'll come back to where we started, right? The stakeholders in the room, the stakeholders in the community were government, academia, commercial, right? We had amazing representation from all of those classes of stakeholders at this summit. It was great to be able to see the leadership from the state level. The CEO of the state was here, right, supporting space. Great to see representation from state legislature, from federal legislature, staff members who came and participated. All of the universities in the state represented, and a lot of great companies from legacy space to brand new space, right? I mean, what a great crowd. We're not done. There's still some great networking and munchies and drinks to happen at the reception, which is upstairs.
Which is upstairs on the rooftop.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jim.
And thank you, Jessica. And thank you all again for coming. Let's go network.